Okay, so first order of business is that the meeting is being recorded. It is both an in-person and online event, so I have people in the room with me, as well as a number of people online, including our main speaker. So I'm going to start by giving a little introduction to this event. So we are gathering here to celebrate the birthday of Ellen Swallow Richards, born Ellen Henrietta Swallow, on December 3rd in 1842 in Dunstable, Massachusetts. And in 1873, she became the first woman to graduate from MIT, and AMITA celebrates her birthday every year in early December. Among her many passions, Ellen believed in the importance of science education for women, for how could a woman keep her family healthy and well-nourished from a position of ignorance? And to quote her, she wrote, "A nation cannot rise rapidly when one half is a drag. Instead of shutting the door of technical and professional work to women, they who love mankind should hold it wide open to allow the utilization of the added energy, which may perchance move the car of progress up and over the hill difficulty." So she was a pioneer in many things, but today we're going to focus on one of her passions, and it was that she was an early environmental activist, and one of her passions was clean water. While earning her degree from MIT, she went on a geological survey where she visited, collected, and tested water samples from mines from runoff in New York, Maine, and Canada to study contamination. You have to understand that in that 1870s, this was a very unusual thing for a woman to do. By the time she graduated in 1873, she would be a nationally recognized expert in water analysis and industrial chemistry. And from 1887 to 1897, Ellen served as an official water analyst for the Massachusetts State Board of Health. And at the Mass Board of Health, she and Professor Thomas Drown analyzed 40,000 water and wastewater samples from 83% of the state population, leading to the development of the first water quality map. And this became the standard for future sanitary surveys. According to the Chemical Heritage Foundation, I quote, "The scale of the survey was unprecedented. It led to the first state water quality standards in the nation and the first modern municipal sewage treatment plant in Lowell, Massachusetts," unquote. Ellen continued as a sanitary chemistry instructor at MIT until she died in 1911. She authored more than 15 books, numerous articles, and reports in environmental science and engineering. So that's what brings us here every year to celebrate. And now I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor Janet Herring, who since 2023 is Director Emerita of the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology and Professor Emerita at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zürich and Lausanne. Prior to moving to Switzerland in 2007, she was a faculty member at Caltech and UCLA. She is a former associate editor of Environmental Science Technology and former member of the Board of Reviewing Editors for Science. She is an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering and Academia, Europaea. She received her PhD from MIT in 1988. And without further ado, I give you Janet Herring.
Great, thank you very much. I will just try to share my presentation. Slideshow. All right, I hope that everybody is seeing this okay and hearing me okay. Yes? Great. Okay, so as we heard, we're all here to celebrate Ellen Swallow Richards, her career and her legacy. And I'd like to thank Julie and the other organizers for inviting me to come and present, even though I can't be there in person. And what I'd like to talk about is this sort of blue thread that connects Ellen Swallow Richards to water science and technology research, especially done by women today. We heard a little bit of this history, but show you a couple of pictures, and then talk about the persistence of some water quality challenges, women in environmental science and engineering, and then move into where we could go with our research in water science, and with one example from Eawag, the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology. And it would be nice if I could get my pointer, but I don't see that. And then talk a little bit about what might be holding us back and how to go forward. So okay, so I hope people see the laser pointer now. So here are a couple of pictures from the history of Ellen Swallow Richards. We heard that she did a lot of water sampling. This is an example of her out in the field. And here is a picture of her laboratory at MIT. And as we also heard, she did a very comprehensive study of water quality. This was conducted between 1887 and 1889. As we heard, over 40,000 water samples. This corresponded to testing the water supply for over 80% of the population. And what she did was to document pollution. What you see on this map, unfortunately not very clearly, are these isolines showing concentrations of average chloride concentrations. And what you see is that in the inner part of the state, these are fairly low, and then they get higher as you move out towards the shore, and certainly around some areas that were very urbanized at the time, and of course still are. Now, these are not problematic concentrations in and of themselves. 0.6 is about the highest concentration parts per 100,000. The current water quality standard is 25 parts per 100,000, but it was indicative of other types of contamination derived from human activities. And so, as we heard, this led to the establishment of water quality standards. And
Here's your phone, Lisa. Good morning. You look very festive there.
Oh, can everybody who's online please put themselves on mute?
So here's an example of the water quality standards where there's international agreement. This is from the World Health Organization. And so we do have these standards. Unfortunately, there's sort of a big but here. And a big part of that but involves the access to safe drinking water in many parts of the world. So this is a ladder for the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, going from safely managed drinking water. And of course, there are many people, especially industrialized countries, that have this access. But then it goes all the way down to having water supplied directly from surface waters without any treatment, and then a couple of intermediate stages. And roughly we have about 500 million people here who are not having either safely managed or even basic improved water supplies. So you can probably imagine which countries this mostly affects, but it's true that even in industrialized countries, there are some pockets of consumers who lack this access to safe drinking water. Another problem are emerging contaminants. This is a map of the United States showing occurrences or detections of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, in tap waters analyzed by the US Geological Survey. And here they tested for over 30 types of PFAS, but we have to bear in mind that there are many more out there. And they did have some frequently detected compounds. And when they detected these two, PFAS and PFOA, every detection was in exceedance of the interim health standards established by the US Environmental Protection Agency in 2022. So this is definitely a problem that we have to be concerned about. And drinking water agencies are moving forward to address this problem of the contamination of the water supply. Another problem which affects the ecosystem, ecological health, more directly than it does human health, is the problem of low oxygen zones here shown in the Gulf of Mexico. So what happens here in these red zones is that the oxygen in the bottom water is so low that benthic organisms that depend on oxygen simply can't survive. And that's what results in these so-called dead zones. These are very clearly attributable to the runoff of nutrients from the Mississippi River, and that the source of those nutrients are agricultural uses of fertilizers. So really a diffuse source, not something that you can deal with at individual wastewater treatment plants. As you can see in the bottom graph, the size of the dead zone has varied over time, and the size is related to the river flow in any given year. Roughly the average 5-year average size is over 4,000 square miles, and it tends to trend increasingly over time. So this is clearly a substantial impact on environmental health, and of course it also affects people through the economy of fishing resources and other types of issues there. So there are, of course, there's a lot of water research going on, and there are a lot of women who are quite prominent in water research. And I'm just going to show you a few examples that are taken from the Clark Prize. This is for outstanding achievement in water science and technology. And these are the women who have won this. I was very honored to be awarded this in 2018. And just this year, I was in Southern California to see Amy Childress be awarded this prize. I knew Amy when she was a student at UCLA, so it's very, very nice to see her there. And so, you know, it's nice to have these women being honored in this way. But this prize has been given out for 30 years, and these are all of the women who have been awarded the prize. So that's only 13%. And I think that really underrepresents the level of activity and the contributions that women are making in this field. Now, there are certainly attempts, and I think very successful ones, to increase the participation of women in environmental engineering. This is just an example from MIT, where there was this workshop really bringing women to MIT to explore these careers in academia. And this is, of course, a really great type of program. I'm sure it's going on, though this is now from about 5 years old. And we really have some super, super role models at MIT. I'd just like to highlight Penny Chisholm, who was a professor when I was a graduate student at MIT. She has been an MIT professor since 1976. And she was one of the scientists featured in this film, Picture a Scientist, mainly because of her work on the MIT report on the status of women faculty that came out in the late 90s. And this is, I have to say, just a really fantastic film. If anybody hasn't seen it, I recommend it very highly. And maybe I'm sure it's been shown at MIT, but maybe it's time to see it again. Another thing I'd like to highlight is that there are very strong male allies for women in environmental science and engineering. And here, I'd just like to highlight Dion Dioniso. He was a co-organizer of multiple symposia on women in science and engineering for the Environmental Chemistry Division of the American Chemical Society. And very unfortunately, he passed away quite young, just at the end of last year. But Dion was a super supporter of women in environmental science and engineering, and there are many other male colleagues who are also very strong allies. So we have a lot of activity going on. We have a lot of women involved in this. This is all great. And then we get to another but. And the but is shown here in this progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are many different ways to present the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the one that's called the wedding cake. And I really like it because it highlights the fact that if we don't manage to get what's called the environmental SDGs right, those are SDG 6, 13, 14, and 15, then the chance of getting the other SDGs or achieving the other SDGs becomes quite small. We depend on a well-functioning ecosystem, and that's where the environmental SDGs come in. Now, this is analyzed every year, and the results from the 2024 SDG dashboard look pretty bad for the environmental SDGs. You can see that two of them, 14 and 15, life below water, life on land, those are both in the major challenges category, and clean water and sanitation and climate action are still in the significant challenges category. And to be honest, even worse is that everything is stagnating. That's these horizontal arrows. We're not progressing at the rate that we need. And so this then brings me to this call from UNESCO, and this came out a few years ago, where UNESCO argued that that higher education institutions must really do more to help achieve the SDGs, to tackle these pressing issues facing the world. And UNESCO suggested that three different things were needed, new ways of doing science and education. The first was to be more inter and transdisciplinary, so not to be constrained by the narrow disciplinary silos that academics are very often find themselves in. Another is that institutions need to be more open and more exchanging with other types of knowledge systems and knowledge creation. And lastly, that the institutions need to have a stronger presence in society and more engagement with other societal actors. So this, it sounds kind of interesting, but there are some inherent conflicts with the time frame and incentives of what I call conventional academic research. And we'll come back to this later. But this is really a question of, if we are going to try as academic institutions to address this big challenge, we have to think about how we're organized and structured. Basically, I just threw this diagram in really because I like it. It shows that achieving SDG 6, which is the water goal, water SDG, with, as you can see, these different sub-targets or sub-goals, that doing that actually helps to address a lot of other SDGs, which are just shown by these tiny symbols, right? So it's not so important which SDGs these are. The point is that water research is really a key entry point towards achieving many of the SDGs. There are a lot of co-benefits here. But if we're going to achieve these co-benefits, the results of water research need to be implemented, right? Just publishing is not implementation. It's not enough, and we need to really think about that as we go forward with research. So that brings us to this topic of actionable research. And let me just start by defining actionable research as research that informs decisions, improves policy design, and/or serves as a basis for implementation and practice. And so this is more than just applied research. Applied research is, yeah, this would be relevant, no problem. But just applied research kind of leaves that application side hanging. It's sort of an end of the pipe thing. We put the stuff out, somebody else picks it up, we don't have to worry about it. And to be honest, that really doesn't work so well. But there are three aspects of actionable research that I think is important to keep in mind. The first is that it should address a real need, an actual deficit in available science and technology. There is a certain amount of repetition out there, and it would be nice to avoid that, just in the interest of achieving the SDGs by 2030, which is only 6 years from now. Then there's having the right research capacity, relevant skill sets, and research interest. I think that's probably true for any kind of topic that one wants to go after. But the third, and I think most important, is that there really need to be opportunities for engagement with implementation partners, and that actionable research works best when there's a close engagement with the implementation partners at the early stages of the research, maybe even in framing the research problem, so that it will be more likely that when results come out, that they will be taken up and implemented. So now what I'd like to do is to show you one example. This is not the newest example from Eawag, but it's a sort of convenient one. I think everybody will have some background around this. This is the idea of using wastewater analysis to track COVID-19. So Eawag is not the only place that did this. There was a lot of this also in the United States, including at MIT. And I'd just like to thank at the beginning Christoph Ort for providing these slides. So the basic idea is very simple. You start with a wastewater treatment plant. Here's one that's collecting roughly 135,000 cubic meters of sewage a day. You end up with these very small samples that are then analyzed for the mRNA from the COVID-19 in essentially the same way that it would be done in a clinical sample. So that's then the way to track a pandemic that I think we're mainly used to. That's the clinical data, where there's one sample per person. And very often, the reason that the person gives that sample is that they feel sick, they have symptoms. Of course, there was a long period where some of that sampling was going on, even if people didn't feel sick, just in order to access different locations or to engage with other people, whatever it was. And then on the other side, there's the environmental data, which is not just one person at a time, it's a whole population. And again, that population is contributing to the COVID-19 that shows up in the wastewater, and the wastewater sample is analyzed again, exactly and more or less exactly in the same way. And you get the same kind of information about incidence, about the dynamics of the disease, about reproductive number and different types of variants. I have to say there was really a lot of new science that went into this in terms of doing this kind of analysis. Wastewater samples are not the easiest things to analyze for these kind of signals, and that took a lot of effort. But basically what you see, and here's our little symbol for wastewater-based epidemiology, it can reveal the virus spread quite early. So this is a comparison in the Italian speaking part of Switzerland, which was the first place that COVID-19 showed up in Switzerland. Some of you may remember that Italy was pretty hard hit by this, mainly because of some exchange, some business trips that people from Wuhan were in this part of Italy, and there's a lot of cross-border activity. So early on, there were the very first cases were found in that region of Switzerland. And then as we went along over time, you can see that you start to see these signatures in the wastewater analysis. And by the time you get here to March 1st, what had happened is that with the clinical analysis, clinical testing, there were 5 positive cases, and there were 2 catchments in which this was detected. In the wastewater analysis, the virus was detected in 7 different catchments. So more of a signal than you had from the clinical testing. But again, this is only people who felt sick. And it is the fact that people can be exposed to COVID-19 and actually shedding the virus and communicating the virus to other people without any symptoms at all. So another thing that you see in the wastewater-based epidemiology is the dynamics of the pandemic very much mirroring what you see in the clinical testing. So that's the blue are the clinical tests. What you see is an interesting weekly signature in the clinical tests. That's not because there were no signatures on the weekends, it's because there was no testing analysis on the weekends. And then in the wastewater, you see very much the same dynamics with two different types of sampling going on. This is for the canton of Zürich. All this kind of data was available in more or less real time on the Eawag website, and this is where you could go to find that if you like. And then what you see again is different variants of concern. So you can look for the different variants. In this case, again, in Zurich, you see that a signature showing up in the wastewater before the clinical samples. And again, this has to do with the fact that you don't see the clinical samples usually until people feel sick, and they are actually shedding the virus before they feel sick. And the same kind of thing in another canton. Basically, we had this for 6 or 7 different wastewater treatment plants in Switzerland. So there was a big effort made in terms of science communication during the pandemic. Some of this was the kind of communication that would be done anyway, but to be honest, much more intensively and much more broadly distributed. But this is broadcast media, it was social media, it was print media. A little bit less common that we would have press conferences. I think almost never that we have press conferences. This is one that was held by the Federal Council of Switzerland and health authorities. And among them was Martin Ackermann, who was chair of the Swiss National COVID-19 Science Task Force. He is a professor at ETH and also a department head at Eawag until he took on this incredibly big job. He's actually now the director of Eawag. He's my successor. And this was a lot of political exposure, which carried its own little challenges. So there were some key elements of success in this kind of program. One was that it was really, really a massive team effort. You already saw Christoph Ort in the first slide. There are 2 other very important players, one at Eawag, Tim Julian, one at EPFL, Tamar Cohn. But a lot of the modeling, and especially pulling out the reproductive numbers, those were done by modelers at ETH Zürich, especially Tanja Stadler. And without all of these people contributing, the work just could not have been done in the same way. Money is always important as well. One advantage in our system is that Eawag and EPFL were both able to provide very early funding for this, just because it seemed like something we really needed to do for the Swiss population. Both Eawag and EPFL are, of course, federal institutions funded by the Swiss government. And then over time, there were funds from the National Science Foundation, from the Federal Office of the Environment, and the Federal Office of Public Health. Then a really key thing was that especially Christoph Ort and the other Eawag engineers have a very, very long-standing trustful relationship with wastewater treatment plant operators in Switzerland. And without that, there's no way this could have all happened. The sampling, despite that first slide I showed you, was not done by the Eawag staff. It was done by the operators of the wastewater treatment plants. And the fact that they were out there all the time doing this work made it possible to do the analyses. And then, as I mentioned, there was a very big effort in communications, having all of that near real-time data available on our website, responding to questions. This was a very, very big and arduous job. So we can do this. Okay, we did this in a crisis. We can move our capacity for research in a direction where there are almost real-time results made available to the public, and in areas where the public is very interested in that. But the fact is, we don't actually do that most of the time. And I think that one of the reasons we don't do that most of the time is the incentives in the conventional academic system. And these are a graphic from a really nice paper. It came out in eLife in 2023. And I just pulled out a couple of panels from this. But a highlight of this is that oftentimes there's a focus, a quite narrow focus in conventional academia on disciplinary research excellence. This is probably less true at technical universities like MIT and ETH than in some other places, but even so, we rely heavily on bibliometrics to make decisions in hiring and promotion. And arguably, even at some place like Eawag, it is hard to provide sufficient appreciation and support for actionable research, which is quite challenging, quite arduous and demanding, and really does need substantial resources. Another aspect of the conventional academic model is there's this focus on what's called here the lone genius, right? And the way this tends to appear is, or be evidenced, is that a lot of prizes are awarded only to individuals or small teams. And, you know, the Nobel is sort of the classic example of this, a maximum of 3 awardees. And there's very often some severe criticism about who's included in that 3 and who's excluded. But even aside from the prizes, most awards have to have a single individual as a principal investigator. And there is just a difficulty in appropriately recognizing the contributions of team members. And I think that we all know from our own experience that that these breakthroughs are not made by one person. And you saw that very obviously in the COVID-19 wastewater example. It takes a team, and we need to be able to recognize this. This last one is just a sort of indicator that the distribution of resources tends to also be somewhat exclusive. And so it's sort of a question of whether that is really representing the talent that's out there and the potential for making advances. So what could we do, right? I would argue that in today's academic world that we tend to be rather self-referential. And if we want to move forward in a different way, we have to change that attitude to somehow become more engaged and responsive. And that is going to mean dealing with the incentives. So if we go back to that same paper, they also make suggestions about how to do that. One is to embed the research and the activities of the universities, the higher education institutions in the society, in the needs of the planet. Another is to be more supportive of team science and more recognizing what's involved with that. It's not easy to do. It needs some support. It needs a real attention to the demands, and then to think a little bit more about the distribution of resources. So I'd like here to just highlight one initiative. This comes out of the University of Bern in Switzerland. It's called the Better Science Initiative. And what they've done here is to put out 10 calls for action. You can find them at this website. And this is just one of them, putting quality before quantity. So, and another thing about that is thinking broadly about what we mean by quality. It's relatively easy to know what quantity is, and we can have and do have some very narrow definitions of what quality is, usually related to publications. But if we think about that more broadly, and if we really prioritize quality, then I think we have a chance to start reshaping the way that people respond to incentives. Another really important thing is that we need to be able to share ideas and attribution. We're professionals. We need at some level to be judged on our contributions, whether that's impact factors or something else. And this is just, I think, one very nice example from the Global Water Pathogen Project of how you can get across this idea that many, many people are contributing. So if you go to this website and you sort of float your cursor over these different points, you see different groups, the orange, and different contributors, the blue. And if you float over one of them, that person pops up, right? And you can go to their websites and things like that. But I think what is really nice about it is that the contributions are really made visible, and it's communicated that this is a consortium kind of project and not just one PI in charge of the whole thing. And since I lived in Los Angeles for 15 years, I can never resist putting up this quote, which really just highlights the fact that we're not doing this as individuals. We're doing all of this stuff as teams. A lot of people are contributing. And the question is, how do we make that visible and acknowledge it? So one thing that is really important then is to think about knowledge going all the way to action. And I like this slide. It's in a sort of strange reference, but it goes beyond thinking about knowledge translation or knowledge brokering, which are relatively common terms, to innovation brokering. And the idea here is that it really looks at that, sort of last mile, what's sometimes in innovation space called the valley of death, the place where you really need somebody who's going to understand, or many people who understand the context and can think about what implementation really means in that context. And these are things where it also has to move outside the university. It's not going to be possible, I don't think, to have all of this stuff inside the university. And that's what's sort of illustrated on this slide. This is a graphic from an article that appeared in EOS a couple of years ago now. And the idea was that in the conventional model, there's sort of this pipeline model for academic careers. You go to school, you stay in school, you're a professor, so you're still in school, you basically die in school. And that pipeline model has led to historical exclusion of members of a lot of different groups. And the question that they raise and what they propose is that there could be something more porous, right? That there would be some way for people to move in and out of this pipeline, or get rid of the pipeline altogether and have this sort of braided river where perhaps somebody from government or private industry could do a sabbatical in an academic institution. Perhaps academics could do sabbaticals not in another academic institution, but in a different type of organizational setting where they would have different kinds of experiences and contacts. So I think that's really something to think about. So basically, I tried to leave a fair amount of time for the discussion. And these are just a couple of starting points for that. One question, perhaps you already heard of this UNESCO call to embrace the 2030 agenda. Perhaps this is the first time that you've heard about it, but I wonder how you respond to that. How do you think universities should respond? Is that a responsibility of the universities? And if there should be a response, how would that relate to core functions of education, operations, research, and public engagement? And what might need to be changed within the university to have this response really be effective? And then there's the concept of actionable research. Maybe you've heard about that already. Maybe you feel like your research already incorporates that concept. How relevant do you think that is? Have you had experience with it? And if so, what was your experience there? So I hope that we'll be having some interesting discussion, but if at some point you would like to continue this in a more of a one-to-one way, I can be reached on email, and I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can reach me there. So I will remember these questions because I'm going to stop sharing my slides and open it up for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, that was very informative. I'm going to just do a little logistics here. So we have people online and we have people in the room. For those of you who are online,
So I'm sorry, Julie, but I don't hear you very well.
you don't hear me very well. Okay. No, it might, I think it's because your computer. You know what? Let me try this. Okay, can you hear me better?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay. Just had to get closer to the microphone. Okay, so if you're online, you can either, raise your hand through the Zoom functions, or type your question into the chat, and I'll either read your question out or I'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself. And if you're in the room, right, there's no microphones in the room. It's all up here. So I invite you to raise your hand and I can either repeat your question, or if you're feeling brave, you can walk up here and talk into the computer. Either way. But okay, I'll go to gallery. Actually, Colleen, are you able to do that? Go to gallery. Okay. Good. All right. I'm going to get started with a question. So as you were speaking, I was thinking, so you were talking about, communication, within professional people, whether they're in academia or in industry or government. What about with communication with the general public? And what do you think is needed to help the general public understanding? Because certainly we need buy-in from the population at large to get things done.
Yeah, so I think that's a very important question. Personally, I think that we need to find ways to work with what you might consider boundary organizations. So some scientists are actually fantastic at communication. They really are. But a lot are not. And those scientists, sorry, I'm hearing some echo. I think Andrea is not muted. Okay, now she is. Thank you. So basically, if we can work with people outside the university also, and to some extent the communication specialists within the university, then the scientists can kind of feed in the content and either be sort of coached on how to present it or let somebody present it who does a better job at it. I mean, I don't think it's necessary for every scientist to fill every single role that might be important. And we should, to some extent, recognize our own limitations a little bit, and just really try and push the content out as much as we can. But that being said, there are a lot of trainings and different programs that will help scientists. If anybody individually is really motivated to improve their communication skills, that's certainly possible to do.
Okay, are there any questions in the room? Yeah, we have a question. She's gonna walk up here to the microphone. It's this computer.
Hi, thank you so much for the clear talk. I came mostly because I wanted to hear your thoughts on like actionable wastewater-based epidemiology. So I'm super happy that you discussed this. Basically, I've been working on like substance overdose monitoring, and with the work of Eric Almier and Biobot Analytics, I realized that it would be much more informative to work with departments of public health and county departments as well, to build a system to inform ahead of overdose related hospitalizations and deaths. And I wanted to hear your guidance, as a finishing PhD student, soon to focus on that during my postdoc, how to partner with the plant operators, the county departments of public health to determine which catchment areas to analyze. And I work in epidemiology, so learning more also about wastewater surveillance and microbiology to some extent, right? Because some of the drugs cannot be detected in samples. So just to prioritize the investigation, because you have such a strong partnership in Switzerland, I thought, and you've been working in the US as well. Yeah, if you have any guidance regarding the setup of these partnerships.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, Switzerland is a little bit of a special case. It's a very wealthy country. It's a very small country. It's relatively easy to make these types of connections. And like I said, those have been in place for a long time. The wastewater-based epidemiology actually came out of a program of looking at illicit drugs in wastewater. So every once in a while, you see these big reports in the newspaper about, capital city in country X in Europe, their favorite drug is cocaine, and the other one is methamphetamine, and the other one is MDMA. And that all comes from wastewater analysis. And so that's been there for a long time, and that has been part of the understanding that you can trade this information back and forth. There are some groups in the United States that are very involved in wastewater-based epidemiology. Thinking particularly of Ali Bohm at Stanford, but I know there are many others. And if you send me a quick email, I can certainly put you in touch with the colleagues here in Switzerland, but also the some of the groups in the United States. I think what you mentioned briefly, the public health, county health offices, I think these are critical intermediaries. In some states, the county health officials have a lot of power. And if you can get them on your side and they can help you with some of these contacts, that's really a good way to go. And that's always, I think, the thing is rather than cold calling people, to think of a connection, a link. Who do you know well enough to talk to and explain what your situation is? And that person might know the next person in the chain, right? And so if you think about it that way, maybe that would help to make the links that you actually need in the end.
Okay, she gives a thumbs up, thank you. And I want to note that Bruce Allen Hecht wrote in the chat, super, thank you very much, exciting to hear these ideas and innovation action. And he also puts in his LinkedIn site, so it sounds to me like he'd like to connect on LinkedIn.
Great.
I would. Thank you very much for your talk. Very informative. And I really like the themes, especially transdisciplinary and working across boundaries.
Thank you.
Okay, there is a question online from Sandy Yulke, and she says the majority of U.S. wastewater treatment plants were built as a result of the Clean Water Act of 1972 and were designed for a 50-year life, and so now need updating, etc. But funding is hard to find. Example, Flint, Michigan. What is the situation in other advanced places?
So that's a very good point. Flint, Michigan, of course, their major problems are with drinking water supply and treatment, not wastewater, but it's still a very relevant comment. So I think that, this is hard to say, but at a certain point, and I think actually back in the 1970s, the US was way ahead of other countries. It was ahead of Europe in a lot of different things. Lead, for example, was taken out of gasoline in the United States a long time before it was done in Europe. And a lot of the pollution control laws for the United States were simply copied in different European countries, and that was the model. But since then, the willingness in the United States to invest in infrastructure and to maintain infrastructure and upgrade it has been lagging significantly behind other countries. Switzerland adores infrastructure maintenance. It's just like one of their favorite things to do. And they're willing to spend the money on it. I know the Biden Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, had a lot of money in it for infrastructure, and hopefully some of that will still be able to continue. But it does take a major investment, and that takes a willingness to to trust in government and to let them do their job. There's been some attempts in different countries, not in Switzerland, to privatize water and wastewater systems, and this has generally not worked well. It has worked extraordinarily badly in the UK. There's huge pollution and lack of wastewater treatment. It worked so badly in some South American countries, I think Bolivia especially, that there were riots in the street. And so, I think it's really, that has to be part of the message, is that government has a role to play in sectors where you just can't expect to make a lot of money off of this thing. You're not going to make profits, and it is essentially a natural monopoly. And that's where government infrastructure aid is needed, and hopefully it will go in that direction.
Yeah, are there other questions in the room? Nope. Okay, any other online? Right. Good. Well, thank you so much for giving us this presentation. I think it's very timely and important in the world today. I appreciate you coming in via Zoom to join us today, and I'd like to thank everyone who participated online and in the room. And with that, I believe we should end our online portion of the program.
Well, I hope that everybody is there in person, enjoys the further conversation and engagement with each other. And maybe we'll hear from some of you in the future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye. The room is clapping. You can't hear them.